اجعل فينا ولا منا شقيا ولا محروما برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. We welcome all of you to tonight's event, tonight's lecture. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for being here. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this something beneficial for all of us, inshaAllah ta'ala. I would like to once again welcome Mufti Abrar Mirza again to our community. He's not a stranger to Dallas-Fort Worth. He's not a stranger to our community. He's been here a number of times before, and we want to thank him for every time we ask him to come, he's very generous with his time. So may Allah reward him, bless him and his family. I don't want to embarrass him by giving his entire bio in front of you. It is available online. I will say this, that Mufti Abrar is one of my go-to people. When I receive tough questions, I send them to him, and he's always very helpful, especially financial issues related to finances. So he's well-renowned, alhamdulillah, in the country for his expertise. He is the head mufti of the Darul Ifta program in Chicago that he himself helped to establish. He's been teaching and answering questions for many years in the Chicago area, both online as well as over the phone, in person. And he's also involved in many other things, but like I said, I don't want to embarrass him by mentioning all of his accolades. So once again, we welcome him. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward him. I would like to ask him to begin the program. Inshallah, whenever he wants, he can allow you guys to ask questions. I will pass on a microphone to the sister side as well, through Sister Sharmeen, and sisters can use that microphone to ask questions, and the brothers will have their own microphone. Jazakumullah khairan.
الحمد لله الذي هدى والصلاة والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى خصوصا على سيد الرسل وخاتم الأنبياء وعلى آله وصحبه الذين اجتبى أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وذروا ما بقي من الربا إن كنتم مؤمنين فإن لم تفعلوا فأذنوا بحرب من الله ورسوله وإن تبتم فلكم رؤوس أموالكم لا تظلمون ولا تظلمون. Dear brothers, respected sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want to just begin by thanking again Sheikh Arsalan, Brother Ahmed, Dr. Irfan, all the team, everyone who is helping arrange this, and those who are always gracious hosts for whenever I'm here, and to all of you for being here tonight. Inshallah, tomorrow and the day after, we're going to cover a broader aspect of the fiqh of financial transactions, which a lot of people think, it's either related to just interest or it relates to home investments and home financing. It's those, but it's a lot more. Inshallah, toward the end of this talk, we'll discuss what that entails. But however, we want to first start with something that's very foundational, which is when we're talking about financial transactions within our context, within non-Muslim economies, where the rules and the structures and everything that are built aren't built in a way that are conducive to the ideals of the Sharia, then how do we look at financial transactions in that sense? And specifically then focusing on the aspect of ribba in contemporary times. And a question may come up about, when we talk about ribba, isn't it pretty straightforward? Isn't it pretty clear? We just say, okay, it's haram, and then move on. Like, what's the point of the next 50 minutes or so of discussion? Now, although we may agree in principle that this topic shouldn't have taken much long to cover, the reality is that it actually does. Because what happens is just being within this environment where everything is structured and everything is built around this concept of ribba, everything is interest-based, sometimes we start to lose the seriousness or the gravity of what this concept and the sin and the societal harms that are entailed within it. And it's built on this foundation of riba being haram, that all the other financial transactions in Islam you can start to understand why they work and how they work. So, inshallah, let's cover this topic, and we'll cover, inshallah, some objections that come up about why people justify ribba, not in principle itself, but within non-Muslim economies, within these, like our context, where somebody may say, yes, I agree that ribba is haram. But we're talking about here in America, within our systems. So while everyone may agree that ribba in itself is haram, we're going to also talk about within our context. There's going to be some discussions in the interest of time, because it's really like an hour and a half worth of presentation. We've got 45 minutes or so. So there are some topics I'm actually going to skip. We're going to cover them in concept, inshallah, maybe tomorrow, which is basically what's our approach to financial transactions, some comparisons between the different financial models that are out there and different economies that are out there within socialism, capitalism, and within the Sharia. We're going to have to skip some of those discussions in the interest of time. Also, the different forms of ribba. Inshallah, we'll talk about this in the class tomorrow. I want to jump into just, when we're talking about ribba, let's understand what Allah SWT mentions in the Quran. There's a few ayahs here. Allah SWT mentions that يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَأْكُلُوا الرِّبَا أَضْعَافًا مُضَاعَفًا وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. That Allah mentions in different places the impermissibility of riba. Like, for example, one ayah Allah mentions, don't consume riba, أَضْعَافًا مُضَاعَفًا, multiplied. Okay? In different places, Allah mentions in different ways. These sets of ayahs that are here, from Surah Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَا لَا يَقُومُونَ إِلَّا كَمَا يَقُومُ الَّذِي يَتَخَبَّطُهُ الشَّيْطَانُ مِنَ الْمَسِّ. That those who take riba will not stand as stands the one whom the demon has driven insane by his touch. And Allah mentions, this is the first ayah that I'm reading. And Allah mentions that ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَا وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. That is because they have said trading is like riba, meaning they're the same or they're similar. And Allah has permitted trading and prohibited riba. Then Allah mentions that فَمَنْ جَاءَهُ مَوْعِظَةٌ مِّن رَبِّهِ فَانْتَهَى فَلَهُ مَا سَلَفَ وَأَمْرُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَمَنْ عَادَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. So whoever receives an advice from his Lord and stops, he's allowed what has passed, and his matter is up to Allah. And the ones who revert back, those are the people of fire, they will remain forever. So this is just the first ayah that I've read. Okay? So Allah has mentioned a few things here. One, that riba is associated with, Allah mentions it's insane, it's shaitani. Okay? Allah SWT has mentioned that the one who engages in it, he's being warned of the hellfire for eternity. Allah continues, and in the second verse here, Allah mentions, يَمْحَقُ اللَّهُ الرِّبَا وَيُرْبِي الصَّدَقَاتِ وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ كُلَّ كَفَّارٍ أَثِيمٍ. That Allah destroys riba and increases charities, and Allah does not like the sinful disbeliever. So again, Allah SWT is speaking about riba and saying that it's associated to a sinful disbeliever. Allah is not associating it with a practicing believer, it's something that's associated with a sinful disbeliever. Then Allah SWT then continues and says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَأَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ لَهُمْ أَجْرُهُمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. Okay? That surely those who believe and do good deeds, establish salah and zakat, and they will have their reward with their Lord, and there is no fear for them, nor shall they grieve. Okay? These are the qualities of the practicing believer in this ayah. In the previous one, with the riba, that's not the believer. Okay? Those are qualities of the disbeliever. Okay? And then Allah again addresses the matter explicitly and says that يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَذَرُوا مَا بَقِيَ مِنَ الرِّبَا إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. That, oh, you who believe, leave whatever remains of riba if you are believers. Again, implying that this engagement with riba is not something that can be associated with taqwa. It's not even something that can be associated with iman. And then Allah mentions thereafter that فَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا فَأَذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. That if you're not going to listen, right, that after everything that Allah has mentioned about riba, associating with insanity and shaitan and saying that Allah destroys it and mentioning that these are not the qualities of the believers, that this is something associated with the sinful disbelievers, that this isn't something that's even congruent with iman. After everything, that if a person is still not going to leave it, then Allah is saying at that point, فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. Then know the declaration of war from Allah and His Messenger. Okay? But still, Allah SWT's mercy is such that He leaves the door open. So He says, that وَإِن تُبْتُمْ فَلَكُمْ رُؤُوسُ أَمْوَالِكُمْ لَا تَظْلِمُونَ وَلَا تُظْلَمُونَ. Okay? That, if you repent, then you have your capital. You shall not oppress, nor shall you be oppressed. Important point here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala associates ribba with dhulm, okay? Oppression. We'll see how. This is one set of ayahs I mentioned in the beginning. There's other ayahs. There are different ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he prohibited. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu mentions that the Prophet ﷺ said that interest, even though it may be abundant, meaning outwardly, it may seem as if when a person is receiving interest, their account is growing. But the Prophet ﷺ said that it will always result in a loss or a humiliation. The hadith in Muslim Ahmad. Okay? That although it seems like it's growing, the lack of any barakah within it is that it's going to lead to a loss. Okay? And there's, in the hadith of Sahih Muslim, it's mentioned as one of the 7 major sins. In a different hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, and also in Muslim Ahmad, Abu Hurairah mentioned that the Prophet said, on the night when I was taken up to the heavens, okay, referring to to Mi'raj, he said that I came upon people whose bellies were like houses and contained snakes that could be seen from the outside of their bellies. And I asked Jibreel who they were, and he told me these are the people who had practiced interest. Okay? So from the Quran perspective, from the Hadith perspective, it is entirely clear that this is something that is haram. Okay? From our nas, from our textual proofs, it is clear. We have clear ayahs, we have clear hadith. It is haram. But let's look at some logical aspects here too. Okay? That ribba is something that is also just logically abhorrent, okay? For many different reasons. Okay? If, for example, you look at the aspect of it being an unfair profiting off of other people's wealth. Okay? What happens if you look at banks, okay? Banks largely profit off of account holders' money while giving them back paltry returns. Okay? They take our deposits, make quote-unquote profit from it, and then give us back a small amount of what they made from our money. Okay? So if, for example, you look at the Chase 30-year fixed rate, okay? This is, I think as of maybe last year, now it's around 6.63%. Okay? This is what they collect from people. Okay? So this is when they give the money out in interest. Take our money as depositors. They take our money and give it on interest to others. And this is what they collect in interest that they gave out using our money. 6.36% or 6.6% now, around that. What do they give back to the person from whose money they're actually using? So the depositors whose money they took, if that depositor has, let's say, a savings account an account that generates interest, we don't keep such accounts, but if they had such an account, the interest that they are paid is 0.01%. Okay? Meaning that for every $10,000 that you give them, they give you $1 from it. Logically, it makes no sense that they use our money, make money off of our money, and then give us back a small amount. And these banks, so these are massive institutions. You're talking about Wells Fargo, I think last year or 2023, I think they made $172 billion or $115 billion. Bank of America was $172 billion. JP Morgan Chase, $158 billion. I think it saw one of the years it saw 63% increase year over year in revenue. The amount that they gave back to the depositors, do you think it went up 63% or any percent? 0.01%. Okay? What logical argument justifies where a person takes interest and is going to pay more than 6.5% back on that from one hand and then receive 0.01% in return? Okay? More than just that unfair, okay? It's oppressive in its nature. Allah associates that with dhulm. Okay? Allah mentions, لا تظلمون ولا تظلمون. Okay? How do you think these countries that are struggling financially are ensured to be perpetually in that state where other countries profit off of their difficulties, or others benefit from their difficulties, their financial difficulties. Take Nigeria here as an example, as a case study. This is from the former president, Obasanjo of Nigeria. He said this in 2000, the year 2000. He said, all that we had borrowed up to 1985 or 1986 was around $5 billion. And he's saying this 15 years later. He says, and we have paid about 16 billion. Yet we are still being told that we owe about $28 billion. That $28 billion came about because of the injustice in the foreign creditors' interest rates. And he says, if you ask me what is the worst thing in the world, I will say it is compound interest. How does $5 billion become $44 billion between 1985 and the year 2000 in 15 years? You know how? On a 15% interest rate. Yeah. Nigeria's outstanding external debt as of Q2 of 2023 was $43 billion. Still, after borrowing $5 billion initially. Okay, now they're stuck with still owing $43 billion after everything they've paid. That interest is a foot on top of that neck that just prevents that person, that country from getting up. Okay? When 75% of Nigeria's children live under the poverty line, and according to UNICEF, Nigeria loses 100 children under the age of 5 every hour due to malnutrition. Every hour, 100 children in Nigeria die because of malnutrition. Okay? That's 2,400 deaths a day. 876,000 children per year dying of malnutrition. And the question comes about, well, why isn't the government doing more to alleviate such malnutrition in the country? Well, as in the year 2022, 96% of the federal government's revenue was allocated to interest payments. That money, that revenue could be used to save these children. That money is being used to do what? To pay the interest. In 2023, that percentage wasn't 96%, it was 112%. 112%, meaning you would have to borrow money on interest to pay the interest debts. And this isn't some weird offshoots example of Nigeria that's and a complete outlier. I mean, many of you here may be from Pakistan. Okay? Pakistan's revenue share in 2023, or interest to revenue, in the fiscal year 2022 to 2023, which is I think the last full year available maybe, was around 60%, meaning 60% of the revenue was being used to pay interest. Instead of education, instead of alleviating poverty, instead of homelessness, instead of all these other things that money could be used for, the largest chunk of money is going toward what? Interest. And it's just something you just cannot get out of. It's pure zulm. It's just pure, simple zulm. It's just injustice. Additionally, this is a concept that is not congruent with Islam. Right? This is it. In Islam, you either have two options. You either, if you want to make money, you go down an investment route. Okay? You invest money, you could have potentially profit, you could have potential loss. Okay? You have to be open to that in an investment. You have to be open to a loss. Or if you don't want to lose any money, then you give somebody a loan, which is an act of benevolence. Okay? So your capital is guaranteed. Whatever you give, that's guaranteed that you're going to get back, but you're not going to make any money off of it. Either you go into a profit venture that has a risk of loss, or you go into an act of benevolence, which you have your guarantee of your loan amount, but you don't make money off of it. You get thawab from it. You have to pick one of the two. This concept is taking something that's supposed to be an act of benevolence, an act of helping somebody through a loan, and being guaranteed your capital back, except now it's going to guarantee the capital and a profit on top of that. It's taking advantage of what should be otherwise an act of benevolence, that you're saying, I'm going to give you money for this venture that you may want to take, but I'm not investing in it. So whether it profits, whether you lose money, it doesn't matter. I'm going to get my money back, and I'm going to get a guaranteed amount on top of that back, regardless of whatever happens with you. Okay? That is not how the Islamic economic system works. Okay? So if a person has earned interest or a person is involved in interest in any type, person should make istighfar and person should get out of it. Okay? That whatever interest was taken should be given away in sadaqah, a person shouldn't take any advantage of it. And if a person has that savings account, or a person has some investments in bonds or anything that is interest related, that person should come out from it. Okay? That this is not something that is in any way justified Islamically. From an ethical, logical perspective as well, this is something that a person just cannot be involved in. However, some have presented objections to justify ribba, not in of itself necessarily, but within our economies, within the non-Muslim economy. Said that, yes, we agree with ribba being haram, but we live in America, right? We're in a non-Muslim society, things work differently, and so on. We'll discuss 3 objections here, and then I'll mention a 4th objection, inshallah, toward the end, and we'll address them. Okay? You'll find a lot, and we're picking 3 out of, we're going to pick these 3, and we'll talk about each one of them individually. There's a small book you can get online. It's available for free. It's called The Text of the Historic Judgment on Interest. It's available for free. The Text of the Historic Judgment on Interest. It's maybe around 60 pages or so, or I forget exactly how many, but it's a short book. You can easily read it. Mufti Taqi Usmani, Hafidhullah, in Pakistan, he used to be on the Sharia appellate bench of the Supreme Court of Pakistan from 1982 to the year 2002. And they had a case in front of them where there was an argument presented to justify interest. So this book is then the Mufti Taqi Usmani's section of the judgment that he wrote that took all the arguments that were presented to try to justify interest, and then there's a response to each of them. Okay? So it's an interesting read for anybody who wants to go further into the topic. It's available for free online. We're going to take three of them. Okay? 2 of them, the 3rd one I don't believe is actually addressed in there. Okay? First is that interest is haram for the purpose of taking advantage of those in need, as opposed to financial advancement. And you'll hear this from entrepreneurs as well that say that, well, a lot of the seed capital and such that happens, a lot of it is just riba based, and we're not dealing with interest where we're trying to take advantage of someone. We're getting ourselves involved in interest for our own personal financial prosperity. That's an argument that is presented. First, the rulings in the Sharia are based on the nature of the transaction. They're not based on the financial status of a person. So, for example, gambling is impermissible. It doesn't matter if the one who's gambling is poor and doesn't have extra money versus the one who's gambling has a lot of spare money, that they could lose the money, no problem, it's not going to have any financial impact to them. It doesn't matter. Gambling is haram, whether that person is poor, whether that person is rich. The rulings of something being permissible or impermissible are based on the nature of the transaction, not the nature of the one transacting. Okay? Second is ribba, even in the time of in the time of the Arabs, in the past, even in the time of the Prophet and such, it was used for commercial purposes. Riba wasn't just for financial survival. People weren't just taking riba for making ends meet or such. That people were involved in riba even at that time for commercial purposes. And it wasn't just even individuals. Sometimes entire tribes used to take loans from other tribes for like financial investments and such. So this objection or this argument that is presented to try to justify it, historically just doesn't hold up either. Okay, just historically it's disproven. And also, the Quran and the Hadith, when they mention riba being haram, they don't restrict it by any specific purpose. Whether you're using it to take advantage of people, whether you're using it for financial prosperity, whether you're using it for whatever intention that you may have, that transaction is impermissible. It doesn't matter what you're using it for. Okay? Second, there's an argument that, well, it's only haram if the rates are exorbitant. Okay? And they justify this by using the ayah that وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا رِبَا أَضَاعَفًا مُضَاعَفًا, that do not consume riba, multiplied manyfold. Okay? So they say, well, look, riba is only haram if the interest rates are exorbitant. But if you have low interest rates, low being subjective, whatever you want to qualify it as, but nonetheless, they say, well, if the interest rates are low, then it doesn't meet the criteria. That's only when the interest rates are exorbitant. This is an argument that's presented. Okay. First, in the Quran, Allah SWT mentions, right, this argument doesn't hold up. Why? Because Allah SWT in the Quran mentions that فَذَرُوا مَا بَقِيَ مِنَ الرِّبَا, leave whatever remains from riba. Okay, whatever remains, not just the amount that is considered excessive. Allah SWT didn't mention leave the excessive amount. Allah SWT mentions leave whatever amount remains from riba. Like, have no dealing in it whatsoever. Beyond your ru'usu amwalikum, Allah mentions that, your capital that you had invested, beyond that, leave everything. Okay? Also, that in the ayah, the doubled and multiplied, okay, adha'afa mudha'afa, is not mentioned as a condition, it's mentioned as like the worst type. Right? You have to understand the way that the ayahs in the Quran sometimes are presented. Not everything is presented as a condition. Sometimes things are presented in their worst case scenario to show that, look, this thing is wrong as it is, but it's even worse in this scenario. For example, Allah mentioned in the Quran that وَلَا تُكْرِهُ فَتَيَاتِكُمْ عَلَى الْبِغَاءِ إِنْ أَرَدْنَا تَحَسُّنًا لِتَبْتَغُوا عَرَضَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. They do not force these slave girls on immoral acts. Don't force them to commit immoral acts if they wish to remain chaste. Now, someone can't say, well, no, that's only if they wish to remain chaste. That's a condition. That's not mentioned there as a condition. That's mentioned there to show that don't do this. This is wrong. Regardless of whether they want to do it or don't want to do it, don't do this. This is wrong. But it's even worse when that person wishes to remain pure and you force them to commit such an immoral act. Then it's even worse. It's not a condition to say it's only wrong in this case. Okay? Also, any other hadith that we have, they don't restrict by any amounts. They don't restrict by any rates. Everything that mentions ribba being haram, okay, mentions it in general without qualifying it, but with only if it's above a certain amount of money or only if it's above a certain rate. In fact, there's hadith to the contrary that show that even the smallest amount is still not permissible. Okay? Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu mentions, he used to say that, man aslafa salafan فَلَا يَشْتَرِطْ أَفْضَلَ مِنْهُ وَإِنْ كَانَتْ قَبْضَةً مِنْ عَلْفٍ فَهُوَ رِبَا. That if you're going to advance something, don't take anything additional back in return. If you give a loan, only take the exact amount that you gave back. Take nothing above that. Even if it's just a handful of like fodder, right, for your horses and such, meaning something that is people are going to look at it and not have any value to it whatsoever. Even if it's something that's so insignificant, but take nothing, not even that, above the actual loan amount that you gave. Meaning even the smallest amount of riba is still riba, it's still haram. Third, this one, that there's an argument that we live in what is called like this, this Darul Harb, a land of war or belligerent nation, however you want to translate it, and that because of that, it's permissible over here. And I want to take, this argument is more popular in certain cities than others. I don't know what it is in Dallas necessarily, but I want to take a slightly academic kind of angle here to discuss. One thing you have to understand from within when we talk about the Hanafi madhab, okay? The Hanafi madhab is not the views of Imam Abu Hanifa. Okay? There's a misconception that the Hanafi madhab is basically the views of Imam Abu Hanifa. That is not the case. The Hanafi madhab is the views of Imam Abu Hanifa and two of his main students, which are Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad. Some of the rulings of the Hanafi madhab are the views of Imam Abu Hanifa. Some of the views of the Hanafi madhab actually are not the views of Imam Abu Hanifa. They're the views of Imam Abu Yusuf or Imam Muhammad. Okay? That's important to understand because the name, although it's associated to Imam Abu Hanifa, because he was because of his seniority, but it's not that the Hanafi madhab is everything that Imam Abu Hanifa mentioned. Okay? It's the view of one of these three students and as verified by the mujtahideen that came thereafter. Okay? Within the Hanafi madhab, there is a view. Okay? There is a view that's been associated to Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad that says that within what is classified as a Darul Harb, a belligerent nation, a war that you are at, or a nation that you are at war with, okay? A non-Muslim nation, right? You wouldn't be, in theory, at war with the Muslim nation, that there is a view that says that within that, that if there's a transaction a ribawi transaction that takes place between a Muslim and a non-Muslim in such a land, then it would be permissible. A ribawi transaction, a riba-based transaction would be permissible. That said, in theory, there's a lot more detail to that we don't necessarily have to get into. However, the idea here is that while this is an opinion, this is not the dominant opinion. This is not the main opinion, and actually, it's in a context that really doesn't apply here. And if a person were to take that opinion, it comes with a package that no one would agree to. That what qualified as this belligerent nation was, it's in of itself is debated about what exactly constitutes such a land to begin with, and the implications are far-reaching, because the way that they had imagined such a land in their context was a land that was truly one that was a threat to Muslims and to the Muslim lands, one that was, even if not in an active war, in a, that it would soon be in a war. That's why, if you look as a package, they said if something does qualify as this belligerent nation, this land of, this Darul Harb, that they said, well, you cannot even live in such a country. That on a permanent basis, you cannot live in such a country. That, anything that causes a person to move to such a country should not be done. That they said that any natural resources discovered in such a country, you shouldn't help the government there in any manner by extracting such resources or giving them any knowledge that gives them any benefit. Why? Because the idea was, well, this is somebody we are at war with. They're going to use that against us. That they said you cannot give any sadaqah therein, that you cannot give any wasiyah therein. So, if a person tries to misapply that and say, well, we are in a non-Muslim nation, so we're going to apply that to our context, it's going to bring about all these rulings that no one would agree with. It would mean that, for example, as Muslims, if we want to do soup kitchens and we want to hand out, money to the poor and to the homeless, to the people here, that by those set of rulings, that we wouldn't be able to do so. Or the fact that, within such a land, all sorts of what are known as like fasid transactions would be permissible. So they say that, in such a land, like a person could engage in transactions that otherwise are impermissible for Muslims, whether that be the sale of liquor, whether that be the sale of pork, whether that be, gambling and such. And there's a certain academic reasoning and discussion that's detailed between that, which is, whether at a basic level, is there any sanctity and is there even any safeguarding of the wealth of such people to begin with? We don't have to get into that, but the idea here is it is something that applies in an entirely different context and absolutely not within our context. And anybody who tries to go down that route is going to end up with not just what they're trying to do, which is allow interest, but they're going to end up in a package of rulings that their own heart will not accept. That no one's going to say, we can also transact in liquor, that we can transact in haram meat, that we can transact in pork, that we can gamble, and then imagine a society, as Muslim society, that we say, oh, all these things are permissible. No one here would accept that. Every single hadith that we have, every single ayah that we have, and every single hadith that we have that has a chain to the Prophet ﷺ makes no such distinction, makes no distinction between whether you're in a Muslim land, whether you're in a non-Muslim land, whether you're in a land that has good relations with Muslims, whether you're in a land that has, is a threat to the Muslims, has no such distinction. The chain that is used for hadith to support this view, one of the narrators, Imam Abu Yusuf, and he himself doesn't adopt that opinion, which shows that there is a problem with that chain. So, without getting too much into detail, this is an argument that is presented that, from an academic perspective, at its base, at its core, may seem like it has an argument, but when you start to really dig into what that means and what that would entail, no one would actually accept that. So, regardless of whatever objections are presented, the moment you start to kind of look at them and you start to put them in the light of the Quran, you start to look at them in the light of the Sunnah, and you look at what they mean, none of these arguments really hold up to anything. So any such attempts to justify riba can have severe consequences, opens the door to all sorts of haram. It desensitizes people to haram. Okay? That way people say, yes, riba may be haram, but this is a different society, this is a different time, this is a different land. People make arguments. It desensitizes people to that. You know that the Muslims, we know and we've known and we state that kind of the whole LGBTQ movement and so on, we acknowledge that that's all haram. But because of the exposure that we've had, despite us saying it's haram, the Muslim acceptance of it is now more than the acceptance of it within the Muslim evangelical white population. And this isn't new. This is since 2017, Muslims have become more accepting than the evangelical whites. And that's despite us saying it's haram. Imagine if we start to say, well, interest, it's not a big deal, or it's not haram, or it's okay within our context and such. What do you think is going to happen 10, 15, 20 years? Our next generation think they're going to have any hatred within their heart for the sin that Allah says, فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, that Allah mentions that this is going to be something that's going to result in a declaration of war. Okay? That this is something that we mentioned logically itself, we've seen examples, is injustice. On what grounds can we justify injustice within? And for us, for Muslims, that we're going to say, when we recognize how much of injustice logically abhorrent this whole riba is, for us to try and make an argument and say, well, it's okay, or that there are reasons why we can engage in it, we're subjecting ourselves to what Allah mentions, لا تظلمون ولا تظلمون, do not oppress and do not be oppressed. We're allowing ourselves to either be in a camp of oppressing or being in a camp of being oppressed. Okay? That sometimes people say that, well, to take interest is wrong, but is there anything that says we cannot give interest? Yes, there is. There's clear hadith on that too. In the hadith in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ gave la'na, cursed. Okay? You have to understand that when the person that Allah ﷺ mentioned is rahmatul lil alameen, that person that Allah ﷺ has mentioned is a mercy to the entire universe. When such a person is making la'na, is cursing something, you have to then really think about how severe of a matter it must be that it merited a curse from the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ said that he did la'na on akil al-riba wa mukilahu, that person who consumes riba and that person who causes someone to consume riba. Meaning, literally in the words, the one who eats and the one who feeds. Meaning the one who takes riba and also the one who gives riba. Both ends of that transaction are impermissible. Okay? That this concept of riba, this is something that it's going to prevent community progress, and it's just an advancement of injustice, something that we have mentioned is dhulm. Okay? That if you look at in the U.S. itself, look in the U.S. Okay? We know that in the U.S. because of riba and the way it's set up, that the top 10% of people own 70% of the wealth in this country, and the bottom 50% own 2.5% collectively. That the imbalance in the distribution of wealth, how does that come about? Through riba. Okay? The top 1% of people in this country hold close to half of all corporate equities and all mutual fund shares. The top 1%. Why? Because the way that the nature of the riba is, it creates that financial disparity between people. Okay? And the average personal loan interest varies for between 10% for it could be between 10%, could be up to 32% for different businesses depending on their credit scores. Okay? And this interest is just so prevalent and it's in so many ways that even if we take a look at something that we all have in our, most likely all of us have in our wallets, okay? Credit cards. Okay? We have credit cards, and credit cards, have rewards, right? Somebody may have a United Visa card where, if you use it, you get points on United mileage, or you have a Hilton card, or you have, some other card that gives you 1% cash back and so on. How does a credit card company, how is it able to give these rewards to people? Like, how are we able to get these rewards? Well, the way it does that is because of it charging interest to the poor, because those people then who use their credit card and are unable to make payments on time, then they're charged interest. And then that money that they collect from the poor in interest is then circulated to those who have enough money and are financially stable, who can apply for these cards and get these rewards. That money from the poor in interest is taken and recirculated to the rich in forms of reward. Okay? That the Federal Reserve did a study in 2023, and they mentioned, and their conclusion was that credit card rewards themselves create an annual redistribution of $15 billion from the poor to the rich. Just credit card rewards, like just credit cards themselves, create a redistribution of $15 billion from the poor to the rich. Imagine then within bank loans and within car loans and within like education loans and with all these other forms of interest that are out there, imagine how much of that redistribution, that zulm is being done on the poor and taking money from them and being fed to the rich. And that's how you end up with these mass disparities between the wealth ownership in this country. And at the end, lastly, we also mentioned that this is something that is a declaration of war from Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That ribba is something that is, we have to understand, it's something that is haram in every sense. Okay? It's haram on an academic level, it's haram on a logical level, it's haram on a spiritual level. Right? The overwhelming majority of contemporary ulama, okay, consider it haram. They declare it haram. Right? It's something that is injustice. It is something that we as Muslims have a responsibility. Allah mentions that kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat lin-nas, that you are the best of nations that were taken out. Why? What was the responsibility? To do amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. We have to promote virtue and prevent vice. When we acknowledge ribba as being zulm, and we have to, because Allah associates it with zulm in the Quran, when we understand that it's a zulm, then we cannot be ones who promote it. We have to be the ones who prevent it. We have to be ones who discourage people from it. Okay? And this is something that we are saying that it's a gamble of one's akhirah. We are risking war with Allah and His Messenger. Who wins a war with Allah and His Messenger? Nobody. That war is Allah and His Messenger win. Okay? We have to understand that fatwas change with context. They change with time. We always have to understand them in that context. This is a quote from Mufti Uthmani, who's one of the leading Islamic scholars in the field of finance, where he mentions that everyone today, more or less like all the major ulama, it's almost like ittifaq, it's almost like a consensus amongst the ulama today. Whether there's Hanafi ulama, whether they're Shafi'i ulama, Maliki ulama, whether they're Hanbali ulama, whatever their fiqh may be, that they all agree that this is something that is haram. Okay? And this is something that is not allowed. Doesn't matter whether you live here, whether you live somewhere else. It's haram for everyone. One objection that I'll address here also that comes up is that people say, well, we understand riba is haram, but it's permissible only if it's your first initial house. Then it's okay. And for that, we have to understand context and how fatwas change with context. Okay? If, for example, let's say we don't have water around. If there's no water around, then what does a person do? I think somebody said it. You make tayammum. Okay? That if there is no water, you cannot make wudu, then you make tayammum. And the tayammum is valid. But what happens as soon as water is available then? That ruling that allows you to make tayammum is now stopped, right? You cannot make tayammum anymore. You could make it tayammum before, but now you can't make tayammum. Now you have to make wudu again. Okay? Because certain rulings are only in certain context. Okay? I think most of us know the ruling about if someone is dying out of hunger, they have no food, and the only food available is pork, then what's the ruling in that case? Allah mentions like Allah mentioned different places, except for what you are forced. Okay? But there's detail there. And the detail that the Mufassirun also mention, the Fuqaha mention, is that in such a case where a person is going to pass away unless they eat something, and the only food available there was some haram food, that person's allowed to eat that haram food, but that person is only allowed to eat to the extent that prevents them from dying. Not even to a stomachful. Okay? Only to the extent that allows them to not die. Okay? So the exceptional ruling that's given is only to the extent of the need itself. If there's some ruling that is because of a need, then it's limited to the need. It doesn't go beyond that. Okay? Many years ago in this country, there was no Islamic financing available. Okay? The only option that a person had was to go to the conventional banks, the ribba approach. Okay? The ulama in those years, they recognized some of the challenges that people faced and that they had no alternatives. Then some of the ulama then at that time gave permission that said that in certain cases, because we have no Islamic options available, you could go and get the loan from the bank to buy a house, but what's the extent of the need? Just your own personal home, one home, not for vacation properties, not for a second home. It's limited to the extent of the need, which is your first home only. That was the ruling in the past when there was no Islamic financing alternatives available. Let's go back to that ruling of that person who's dying out of hunger, and what's allowed for them? That they can eat the haram food, but only to the extent that that's going to prevent them from dying. What happens now if there's halal food made available? How much of the haram food can they consume? None of it. Okay? None of it. Once there's any halal food available, that permission to eat from the haram ends. Now they cannot eat haram food, not even a single bite. Why? Because that ruling was only in certain contexts, and that context now changed. Likewise, in that time, there was a ruling that because of the lack of alternatives, that if a person were to get a loan from a conventional bank for their first home, that there was, the ulama at that point said, because we have no alternatives, there is some scope for it. However, that context has changed. Now there are Islamic alternatives. There are alternatives. Some people may have questions about how some of the Islamic financing works. Inshallah, we'll talk about it in our class. There's different Islamic financing models available, how they work, how they differ from conventional financing. Are they really just the same thing with different words and so on? Inshallah, we'll talk about those details. They're not. How so? We'll talk about that, inshallah. But the idea here is that fatwa was in a certain context. That context has changed. Now there are alternatives. So just like it's no longer allowed for a person to consume haram meat when halal is available, it's no longer permissible for that person to get a conventional loan, even if it's for their first house, now when there's Islamic alternatives made available. Okay? So we have to understand that there's context and things change, and that ruling, yes, that fatwa was there. That fatwa was there. And it held some legitimacy at that time in that context. But once that context changes, just like you cannot continue to make tayammum when there's water available now, you cannot act on that ruling when the context has changed, where there are alternatives available. Okay? So that's on the aspect of ribba. However, before I conclude, I want to clarify one thing. When we're talking about the financial laws in Islam, okay, the hurma and the impermissibility of ribba is a foundation. Okay? A lot of the rulings are built on that concept that we cannot engage in interest. Okay? But the rulings go beyond just that. Okay? And we need to understand how some of the rules of Islamic financing and financial transactions in general work. Okay? And there is a need for us to understand that. Why? Because Rasulullah mentioned, Abu Hurairah narrates the hadith in Sahih Bukhari, that a time will come upon people where a man will not care about what he takes, whether it is halal or haram. Okay? That wealth, this is a ni'mah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has to be earned via halal, it has to be spent in halal. Okay? Allah mentions that ثُمَّ لَتُسْأَلُنَّ يَوْمَئِذٍ عَنِ النَّعِيمِ. You're going to be asked on that day about Allah's favors. The wealth that we have is a favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to ask on the day of judgment, how was that ni'mah used? Where was it earned from? Where was it spent? Okay? So we have to understand beyond just the impermissibility of riba. We talked about riba, we talked about how from a textual perspective it is haram, we talked about how from a logical perspective it's haram, from a societal impact permissible aspect and such, but what are the rulings that go beyond that? Okay? So when we talk about fiqh of financial transactions, right, then these are like the topics that we'll cover. Okay, fine, interest is permissible. What constitutes interest? Okay? Interest isn't a singular thing. There's different forms of interest. Okay? How does a person dispose interest? What are the different financial models of a sale? Okay? That a transaction, when I sell something, when you buy something, right, there's different forms of those. Okay? Whether we recognize or not, sometimes some of the sisters in the community feel like this aspect of finances and such, this is for the men, this isn't really for us. Anybody who goes and you fill up gas, that's a financial transaction. You buy grocery, that is a financial transaction. You earn money from your employer, that's a financial transaction. Okay? Every one of these, your children go to school, you pay tuition, that's a financial transaction. Every single person is involved in a financial transaction. You go out to eat, that's a financial transaction. Okay? No one can say that financial transactions, it's for my husband, it's for my so-and-so, it's not really for me. Or someone says that, I don't really invest in the stock market, so this isn't a topic that's relevant for me. It's relevant for every single person. Every single person is involved in financial transactions. It's just life, that's just how life works. Everyone is involved in a financial transaction. You have to understand how they work. You buy something from the store. It has a return policy, has an exchange policy. There's Islamic rulings that are associated with that. Okay? What are the rights within a transaction? The different methods of payments. Okay? How do checks and credit cards and such, how do they work and so on. We'll talk about mortgages. Okay? Not just, I don't mean by mortgages, I don't mean what people normally think of a mortgage, which is that you take a loan from the conventional bank. People think of that as a mortgage. Technically, that's not a mortgage. That's just a loan. The house that is a security to pay back the loan with interest is held as a mortgage. Okay? That's technically a mortgage, not the going to the bank and getting a loan. That's just a loan. Okay? So how do actual mortgages themselves work? We'll talk about that. Currency exchanges, forex, cryptocurrencies. Right? If a person owns property that they're leasing out, employment, okay, all of these things, this concept, foundational concept of Allah mentions that we have to make ta'awun, we have to assist each other in birri wa taqwa, okay? in good and in taqwa, and we have to make sure that we're not assisting each other in what is wrong and sinful. What constitutes assisting in sin? What constitutes as assisting in sin? Okay? And there's so many rulings that are actually built off of that. Okay? Someone drives Uber, they pick up somebody, okay, and now the destination is a bar. Are they assisting in sin? I mean, you're transporting somebody, and you're taking them to a bar. Are you now assisting in sin? Are you sinful for that? Okay? We'll talk about that. Okay? What are the different business models? If somebody wants to start a business, if somebody wants to invest in a business, if somebody wants to infuse capital in an existing business, what are all the different models for that? Okay? And then once you understand all these different concepts, you'll understand kind of how they come together and then how Islamic financing is actually structured. Okay? So inshallah, we'll cover all of these topics tomorrow and inshallah on Sunday. However, all these topics are built on our foundational belief and understanding both from scripture and just from logic of why the conventional system that is built on interest is problematic. Okay? And why there is a need for an alternative, which is then the Islamic financial model. Inshallah, we'll talk about that. Okay? Okay. I think Adhan's at 10 o'clock. Okay. So I think we'll open it up for some questions, inshallah. Yeah. Okay. I think the brother had. Yeah. I'm so. Oh, yeah.
Are you going to be talking about the transactions to avoid taxes?
We'll talk about, when we talk about rahan, specifically not necessarily about avoiding taxes, but it can come up as a question, we can address it, inshallah. But we'll talk about the concept of rahan, yes, inshallah. Okay. So inshallah, we'll talk about, when we talk about financial transaction, we'll talk about like the foundations that all the investments are built off of. In the past, I think here as well, like I think we did sessions specifically focused on investments themselves. But generally speaking, there's standards that dictate what you can invest in, what you cannot invest in, what constitutes as permissible or not, because every single company will have some amount of haram. Okay? It doesn't matter what the nature of the business is, every single company, when they get income, when they get revenue, is going to put it in an income generating account. At minimum, they'll have some interest from that. Okay? It's almost like a violation of fiduciary responsibility if they're going to hold it in a non-interest generating account. Okay? So every single company will have some amount of haram. So what type of companies can you then invest in, given that every company has some amount of haram? Inshallah, we'll talk about some of the foundations for that, but there's a separate course that we have done in the past that kind of goes deeper into investments. But to your comment about, you know, if a person has a limited set of options, then you would look at what are known as the AOFI standards that help guide whether it meets certain thresholds for permissibility. If you've used like apps, you know, that are out there like Zoya and these other ones, they all generally build their compliance measures off of those standards. They're called the AOFI standards. Yeah, I mean, there's a separate kind of detailed topic. Zoya has, you know, some of these apps have, there are two things. They do financial analysis, and they do like a business analysis, where the financial analysis is like purely taking the numbers from the reportings and saying like, okay, how much was the interest, how much was the debt ratio, and so on, and whether it meets threshold. Generally, those are fine. But then there's an analysis on the business aspect about whether the business itself is a permissible business. That's where a lot of these apps actually get a lot of rulings wrong, and it's built on that concept of assisting in sin. So when we talk about that concept, you'll start to understand then where a lot of these companies actually start to make errors. Yeah. The course? The course is going to set like all the foundation. So I would say, I think the course, like you guys call it 101 or 201 or 202. Okay. So qualify as 202, but it is, I would say that it sets all the foundations for all the, like, inshallah, at the end of the course, okay, you will have a very strong understanding of how financial transactions overall work, how investments work, how Islamic financing works, answers to some objections, kind of a foundational understanding in general across the topic that is beyond just home financing and like some of the usually specific topics that are discussed, inshallah. Okay. I was told this last question. Okay. Did you? Time for Isha. Okay. Inshallah, then, inshallah, I'll see hopefully many of you inshallah tomorrow. Okay. So, bihamdik, subhanaka wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.